Vietnam was not a battlefield so much as a living organism that wanted you dead. The air stuck to your skin like wet plastic. The insects arrived in squadrons and left with blood. And the trees stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking light, sight, and sanity. Soldiers joked that you didn't enter the jungle, you were swallowed by it. Every footstep felt like trespassing inside a green beast that breathed, sweated, and occasionally ate people. To Washington's planners, this was intolerable. The United States had helicopters, napalm, and the kind of logistical ego that could pave continents, yet an army of farmers was beating them with camouflage and patience. Visibility meant survival, and the Viet Cong had turned invisibility into an art form. American commanders wanted a way to see the enemy again, preferably before being shot by one. And that's when someone had the idea that could only have been born in the 1960s. If the jungle hides the enemy, kill the jungle. Not burn it, not bomb it, chemically erase it. The concept sounded like progress and smelled like hubris. Early trials carried cheery names such as Operation Hot Tip and Operation Barn Door, the kind of branding you'd expect from a fertilizer catalog, not a prelude to ecological warfare. Yet when helicopters returned with photos of wide brown scars cutting through once solid green, the brass were thrilled. At last, they could see the ground again. By 1961, the plan had gone official under the oddly domestic name Operation Ranch Hand. Its motto, "Only you can prevent forests," was a parody of Smokey the Bear that managed to turn environmentalism completely inside out. The idea was simple: spray herbicides from the air, strip away the foliage that concealed ambushes, and starve the Viet Cong by killing their crops. No close combat, no heavy losses, just a few plane loads of chemistry doing God's landscaping. From a distance it looked like genius. Pilots flew over the highlands and delta alike, watching thick green dissolve into sepia skeletons within days. Commanders celebrated the newfound clarity on reconnaissance photos. Politicians back home saw bar graphs trending upward and assumed victory was just a few barrels away. After all, how dangerous could weed killer be? Americans had been using it on lawns for years. What no one wanted to discuss was what happened to everything that lived under those leaves. Rice paddies turned to mud flats. Water buffalo collapsed in fields that had gone suddenly sterile. Villagers watched their fruit trees die overnight and their children cough blood by morning. The jungle might have been the enemy, but it was also the roof, the pharmacy, and the pantry for millions who had never heard of communism or capitalism, only rain and harvest. Yet in every briefing room the same phrase echoed: mission accomplished. The foliage was gone, the maps were clear, the metrics looked fantastic, and somewhere in a fluorescent lit office, someone decided the next logical step was to expand the program. More area meant more barrels, more contracts, more efficiency. No one asked whether efficiency belonged in the same sentence as defoliation. For the troops slogging through the aftermath, the results were surreal. They'd marched through valleys of skeletal trees, the trunks bleached and cracked like old bone. The ground felt dead under their boots. No birds, no bugs, no sound except the shuffle of gear and the distant drone of another aircraft spraying something nobody could pronounce. The war had started as a clash of ideologies and was quickly turning into an industrial experiment. But that was the American way. Solve a problem with technology, then solve the new problems with more technology. The brass wanted chemicals, and the factories back home were more than happy to oblige. Dow Chemical, Monsanto, and a small army of subcontractors lined up to supply the miracle potion that could make trees disappear faster than government budgets. On the procurement charts, it looked like progress. On the ground, it looked like apocalypse. The jungle had been the first enemy of the war, but soon it wasn't the worst one. A new adversary was coming, odorless, colorless, and stored in steel drums with a bright orange stripe. The soldiers would spray it, breathe it, and wade through it without knowing that it would outlive them all. The jungle had been stripped back to its skeletons, and now the logistics wheels turned towards mass production. If war was going to be fought with chemistry, industry would supply the chemistry. Dow, Monsanto, Hercules, the names read like corporate roll call rather than a list of war criminals. And they answered the call with the efficiency of firms that measured success in tons produced per hour. What went into those orange-striped drums was, on paper, ordinary enough. 2 agricultural herbicides, already familiar to farmers, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. Separate, each had a track record of knocking down broadleaf weeds on Midwestern farms. Combined, they made a particularly effective defoliant. Mixed at scale and shipped with military haste, the blend became industrial-age Agent Orange. The stripe of orange on the barrel was a color code. It became a brand. But manufacturing at wartime pace is a different animal from manufacturing at laboratory pace. The chemical reaction that produced 2,4,5-T could, under less than ideal conditions, form a toxic byproduct called dioxin, specifically TCDD, a molecule later described in sober scientific prose as extremely toxic. In small doses in a lab, dioxin produced grotesque deformities in rats and mice. It bound to fat and tissue and did not simply vanish after a weekend of rain. Dioxin was stubborn in ways that made accountants uncomfortable. It stuck around. Inside production plants, memo streams and shift logs told a story that didn't match the glossy brochures. High temperatures, rushed reaction times, and corners cut to meet the explosive demand all increased the yield of unwanted dioxin. Engineers and mid-level chemists made notes, flagged batches, and in some cases recommended slower, cleaner processes. The response from the top was invariably the same: keep the lines running. Delays meant soldiers in the field didn't get their next load of tactical herbicide. Soldiers, of course, were not in the room where production quotas were drawn. Publicly, the manufacturers leaned into reassurances. Agent Orange is safe when used according to directions. Read press statements that resembled safety warnings for household products. Government briefings echoed the same line with bureaucratic polish. Internally, though, memos circulated that looked less like corporate calm and more like fear dressed in spreadsheets. Test animals born with limb defects, internal correspondence about contamination in auxiliary equipment, and pilot batches with elevated dioxin levels were all folded into the files labeled for internal use only. The military's demand was unambiguous: volume, speed, and reliability. The companies delivered. Barrels were painted, loaded onto ships, and sent into the tropics. The color codes, purple, white, pink, blue, and orange, meant different blends and different contractors, but the stripe everyone remembered was orange, Agent Orange. Nobody whose job description involved signing purchase orders wanted to get bogged down in philosophical debates about ecotoxicology when there were maps to clear and timelines to meet. There was a Darwinian logic at work that no one seemed eager to name. In wartime, the calculus of acceptable harm shifts. The argument, stated bluntly in some procurement meetings, was utilitarian, an ugly arithmetic that placed a lower value on the lives of distant villagers than on the schedule of returning troops. If production slowed, the official story went, more Americans might die in ambushes. That logic allowed shortcuts to be framed as patriotism. At the same time, the science itself was still messy. Epidemiology moved slowly. Cause and effect threads take years to weave out of noise. In the 1960s, dioxin's long-term effects on humans were not yet fully mapped. That uncertainty became a convenient shield. No definitive proof is a phrase designed to comfort committees and derail lawsuits. It is not designed to comfort mothers watching their babies be born without arms. Factory workers, mechanics, and lower echelon employees had their own small rebellions, whispered warnings, attempts to clean contaminated vats, and makeshift protective measures that management forbade because they slowed production. Pilots and ground crews received cursory briefings that sounded like hazard training for lawn care service, not a theater of war. Protective gear was scarce, knowledge of chronic toxicity rarer still. The chain of command preferred simple slogans and tidy graphs over messy scientific debate. It was easier to call a chemical tactical than to call it dangerous. By the time the first full-scale shipments had reached Southeast Asia, a paradox had formed. The very thing that would clear jungle canopy and reveal enemy trails also carried with it microscopic particles that could lodge in fatty tissues, enter food chains, and persist for decades. The war's technical solution contained the seeds of the longest-lasting problem. Manufacturing had traded caution for capacity, and what was shipped under the banner of military necessity carried, invisible to the naked eye, a long half-life and a readiness to haunt. So the drums rolled out, the C-123s were refueled, and the missions multiplied. From the perspective of bases and battalions, the logistics were tidy. Barrels arrived, tanks were filled, and sorties were scheduled. From the perspective of ecosystems, of rivers, rice paddies, and human bodies, the shipment was anything but tidy. What had been conceived as a technical advantage now rode the wings of mechanized supply chains into millions of lives. The factories had done their work, the planes were ready, the experiment was airborne. The drums reached Vietnam like any other supply shipment, stenciled, stacked, and anonymous. Each barrel bore an orange stripe that meant little to the quartermasters unloading them, just another color in the logistical rainbow of war. From the docks they rolled into storage depots, then into the bellies of C-123 provider aircraft that had been modified to carry spray tanks instead of bombs. Their crews, mostly young men who wanted flying time more than glory, painted mascots on the fuselages and joked about their mission. Humor was armor. It kept the mind busy while the hands loaded poison. They called the program Operation Ranch Hand, a title that made the war sound like a community project. Its motto, "Only you can prevent forests," appeared on patches and posters. Officially, these were herbicide missions. Unofficially, they were crop destruction runs. The planes flew low and slow, releasing long white veils of chemical mist that drifted downward in ribbons. Within days, the lush canopy below would brown, curl, and fall away. Photographs from reconnaissance flights looked like before and after shots of two different planets. At first, the results thrilled the command. Convoy routes became visible again, enemy movement through the mangroves slowed, villages suspected of aiding the Viet Cong found their rice fields sterile. To the men drawing lines on maps, this was data-driven success. The jungle was finally losing. But on the ground, the victory looked different. Farmers waded into fields that smelled of rot, their feet blistering in water that suddenly killed fish. Cattle refused to graze. Children coughed and bled from the nose. The same wind that stripped the trees carried the mist into rivers and wells. Soldiers advancing through the cleared zones noticed that even insects were gone. What remained was silence, a landscape stunned into stillness. The air crews kept flying. Between 1962 and 1971, they sprayed more than 19 million gallons of herbicide, over 12 million of them Agent Orange. Each sortie covered miles of countryside. The operations log read like an agricultural report. Hectares treated, barrels consumed, canopy density reduced. Every number looked tidy enough to hide its implications. Ranch Hand was winning by metrics, and in a war built on body counts and bar graphs, that was what mattered. For the pilots, the job was routine. The smell clung to the aircraft, a faint chemical sweetness that mixed with jet exhaust. They worked without masks, wearing flight suits that would later test positive for contamination. Mechanics wiped tanks with rags and tossed them into burn pits. When the wind shifted, spray drifted back over the wings, coating windows and hair. Some joked that if it killed the plants that fast, it must keep mosquitoes away. Nobody told them otherwise. Down below, ground troops operated in the aftermath. They patrolled through dead forests, set up perimeters in field where even the weeds had died. Water trucks filled canteens from rivers streaked with oily film. Men noticed their boots cracking from exposure and their skin breaking out in sores that didn't heal. Medical officers called it contact dermatitis and handed out ointment. The war had no shortage of explanations. The defoliation was most aggressive along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline of North Vietnamese supply. Entire valleys were reduced to skeletal gray. Satellite images later showed that more than a fifth of South Vietnam's forests were stripped bare. The strategy's irony became obvious even then. The terrain cleared for tactical advantage was also the terrain that shielded the soil from monsoon erosion. When the rains came, topsoil slid away, leaving sterile clay. Agent Orange had done its job too well. The locals adapted in a way that people always do when survival demands it. They planted new crops, fished in poisoned streams, and learned not to drink from certain wells. Soldiers moved on to the next sector. The planes flew another day, another grid. The mission logs grew thick. What they didn't record was how the land smelled after the spray, or how the wind carried that scent miles beyond the target zone. By the late 1960s, word of the chemical had spread among the troops. Some called it the orange stuff. A few airmen began refusing spray mission, citing sickness and headaches. Their objections were quietly transferred to administrative files. Commanders reminded everyone that the defoliant was government approved and laboratory tested. The emphasis was on morale, not morality. The jungle was receding. That was proof enough of safety. Then came the first official doubts. Field doctors noting clusters of skin lesions. Scientists reporting contaminated soil samples. Civilians filing complaints. But war has a momentum of its own, and by the time the memos reached the desks that could have stopped the spraying, the next year's schedule was already set. Ranch Hand was a success story on paper, and success stories are hard to cancel mid-print. When the final sorties flew in 1971, the landscape of South Vietnam bore scars visible from the stratosphere. Great brown corridors cut through what had been emerald canopy. Cropland failed, rivers changed course, wildlife vanished. The defoliant had accomplished its mission and exceeded it. The jungle could grow back. The humans caught beneath it had no such guarantee. Back at Bien Ho, the airstrip where many missions began, empty drums piled in rows behind the hangars. Some were reused to store fuel, others discarded in ditches where rainwater pooled. Nobody called it waste management. Nobody called it anything at all. The planes were reassigned, the crews rotated home. The operation closed with little ceremony. Just another project wrapped up and logged as complete. The war would grind on for years, but the chemistry of Ranch Hand lingered. The rain carried it into the soil, the rivers moved it to the sea, and the people carried it in their blood. The jungle had lost its leaves, and the war had lost its boundaries. When the last C-123s stopped spraying and the barrels were shipped home or buried in the mud, the landscape didn't heal. It just stopped complaining loud enough for headquarters to hear. The trees would eventually return, but the people never quite did. What the Air Force left behind was an invisible residue that didn't care about ceasefires or treaties. It settled into soil and water, into lungs and livers, into the daily rhythm of life that didn't end when the war did. In the villages that lay beneath the flight paths, strange things began to happen. Rice seedlings refused to sprout. Buffalo were born with twisted spine. Children arrived missing fingers or eyes, or the luck to survive their first month. Locals gave the poison a name that translated roughly to the American sickness. They didn't know about dioxin or toxicology. They just knew the sky had rained death that never washed away. Vietnamese doctors collected samples, wrote reports, and sent them to ministries that no longer existed by the time they arrived. Thousands of miles away, American veterans were returning home and finding that the war had followed them back. They came with rashes that didn't fade, nerves that tingled like live wires, and fatigue that felt like being slowly drained from the inside out. Hospitals called it coincidence. The Veterans Administration called it stress. Every symptom had an alternate explanation. Jungle rot, bad diet, post-traumatic imagination. The one explanation nobody wanted to touch was the simplest, that the war had poisoned its own soldiers. The companies that made Agent Orange insisted the chemical was harmless in field concentrations. Their studies, conveniently funded by themselves, showed no long-term risk. Government scientists used the phrase, "no conclusive evidence," which in Washington translate to, "please stop asking." When independent researchers found links between dioxin and birth defects in lab animals, the response was bureaucratic whiplash. Requests for more data, more time, more silence. For the veterans, Silence felt like betrayal. They had done everything their country asked and were now being told their suffering was an accounting error. Meetings sprang up in VFW halls where men compared symptoms the way they once compared war stories. A few brought photographs of children with cleft palates or missing limbs. The resemblance to the Vietnamese cases was uncanny, but drawing that connection out loud sounded like treason. The first generation of advocates formed around kitchen tables and filing cabinets, trying to force the government that drafted them to finally acknowledge what it had done. Meanwhile, the poison kept moving. Dioxin, unlike most wartime weapons, doesn't surrender. It clings to fat, hides in sediment, and travels up the food chain like a stealth soldier. Fish absorbed it, pigs ate the fish, people ate the pigs. In the hot zones around Da Nang, Bien Hoa, and Phu Quoc, concentrations in soil samples ran thousands of times higher than anything considered safe. Entire provinces became unwilling laboratories for chronic exposure. By the late 1970s, the Red Cross of Vietnam estimated that hundreds of thousands of people were living with chemical injuries that had no treatment and no expiration date. Back in the United States, the public slowly caught on. News crews filmed veterans with skin lesions that looked like burns, and interviews with mothers showing photo albums of children born deformed. The Pentagon issued careful statements about ongoing evaluation. The manufacturers issued their own about deep concern. No one used the word responsibility. The burden of proof rested on the sick. By the early 1980s, the number of affected Americans had climbed high enough to be politically inconvenient. Hearings were held, senators expressed outrage calibrated to the cameras. Experts testified in the dry language of dose-response curves and metabolic pathways, reducing human agony to decimals. For every new study linking exposure to cancer or diabetes, another appeared to cast doubt. The government liked the balance. It made inaction look like prudence. Vietnam's story, meanwhile, had almost disappeared from American news. The country was rebuilding in poverty, and the victims of defoliation were folded into that larger tragedy. International scientists who visited reported contaminated lakes and children who could not stand, but their findings were dismissed as propaganda. It was easier, politically and emotionally, to believe that the damage ended with the withdrawal of the troops. The truth was slower and crueler. The dioxin half-life in tropical soil runs up to a decade, sometimes longer in sediment. Each rainy season carried it downstream. Each generation passed a little more of it along in blood and milk. Time didn't dilute the poison, it distributed it. For the Americans who had worn the uniform, realization came in stages. First anger, then disbelief, then the kind of grim acceptance soldiers know too well. They weren't dying in battle, they were dying of it. The letters they wrote to Congress were full of the same language they'd used in combat reports: dates, units, coordinates, and casualty lists. The enemy this time had no flag, no uniform, and no surrender to sign. By the end of the decade, even the official agencies could no longer maintain the fiction. The pattern of illnesses was too consistent, the stories too numerous, the cemeteries too full of men who should have lived longer. But acknowledgement came without apology. The phrase, possible service connection, became the bureaucratic bandage placed over what was, by then, an open wound. Agent Orange had stopped falling from the sky, but it was still raining in people's lives, slowly, invisibly, endlessly. The war had moved from jungles and rice paddies into chromosomes and lymph nodes. The enemy had changed form, but the casualty reports looked the same. Too many, too young, too late. By the late 1970s, the war was supposed to be history, something to study, not something still unfolding inside people's bodies. But across the United States, a quiet uprising was brewing in living rooms and veterans' halls. The men who'd survived the firefights were now fighting bureaucracy, and this time the enemy wore suits. The Veterans Administration continued to deny claims, citing insufficient evidence. It didn't matter that the same institution had ordered the spraying. The burden of proof rested squarely on the dying. In basements and church halls, veterans shared medical records, death certificates, and photographs of their children, hoping that together they might become statistically significant enough to be believed. What had started as a rumor became an organized movement. They called it simply the Agent Orange fight. The companies that produced the chemical, Dow, Monsanto, Diamond Shamrock, and others, had the best lawyers money could buy. Their defense was elegant in its cynicism. The government had specified the formula, bought the product, and deployed it. If someone had been harmed, it was the government's fault. The Pentagon, meanwhile, argued that no scientific consensus linked Agent Orange to the diseases being reported. Each pointed to the other. The loop closed perfectly. The first class action suit in Agent Orange product liability litigation began in 1979 and dragged on for years. Thousands of plaintiffs, mountains of evidence, and a paper trail that reached into the Oval Office. The company settled in 1984 for $180 million, a figure that sounded substantial until it was divided among the tens of thousands who had filed claims. It worked out to a few $1,000s per victim, about the price of a used car in the decade they were dying. The corporations admitted no guilt, and the government accepted none. While the courtrooms filled with lawyers, the laboratories filled with data. Independent studies confirmed what the veterans had been saying. Dioxin caused cancers, nerve disorders, and birth defects. The Air Force's own ranch hand study, intended to disprove any connection, began showing elevated rates of disease among personnel who had handled the chemicals. The results were quietly rewritten. The conclusions softened. Inconclusive became the official word, a bureaucratic prayer that kept budgets safe. Television brought the crisis into American homes. Images of babies born with severe deformities in Vietnam aired next to interviews with American families showing their own children with similar conditions. It was impossible to unsee. Under public pressure, Congress held hearings. Senators expressed outrage for the cameras and promised action. Most of them had voted for the war. The VA eventually agreed to reevaluate claims, but insisted on a list of presumptive conditions that would qualify for compensation. Anything not on that list required veterans to prove direct causation, an impossible task when exposure records had been lost or destroyed. The language of denial evolved. Now it was procedural rather than political. In 1991, nearly 30 years after the first spray missions, Congress passed the Agent Orange Act, finally acknowledging a direct link between service in Vietnam and a defined set of illnesses, certain cancers, diabetes, neuropathy. It was a victory on paper, but a hollow one. Most of the original petitioners were dead or too sick to care. The act opened a door, but it opened onto a graveyard. Across the Pacific, Vietnam sought its own reckoning. The government filed lawsuits in U.S. courts, arguing that the chemical companies had violated international law by producing and supplying what amounted to a biological weapon. The cases were dismissed under the doctrine of sovereign immunity. Foreign plaintiffs could not sue the United States or its contractors for acts committed during war. The victims were left outside the courtroom, invisible again. Back in America, the companies rebranded and diversified. Dow focused on plastics and household goods. Monsanto pivoted to seeds and biotechnology. Press releases spoke of innovation and sustainability. The same firms that had once filled barrels for bomb bays now sponsored environmental initiatives. The irony was corporate art. For the veterans, the settlement money went quickly. Medical bills, funerals, second mortgages. The checks came with disclaimers that barred further suits. The government set up the Agent Orange registry, a gesture that felt more like data collection than justice. They were statistics now, entries in an archive that proved the nation could measure tragedy without fixing it. By the turn of the century, scientists were still finding elevated dioxin levels in sediment near the old air bases. The cleanup programs would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and take decades. The veterans organizations kept petitioning to add new diseases to the presumptive list, each success a small victory carved from the slow decay of denial. And through it all, the chemical companies kept reminding the public that their products had changed, that they were building the future. But the past, like dioxin, had a long half-life. Agent Orange became shorthand for everything reckless about the war. Science harnessed without foresight, command decisions made without conscience, and the quiet arrogance of believing that nature and people could be managed by formula. The men who had sprayed it, the ones who had walked through it, and the ones who had been born under its clouds all shared the same lesson written into their scars. Wars end, but consequences don't. Half a century later, Vietnam's jungles have recovered more gracefully than the people who lived through their destruction. From the air, the forests are green again, dense, alive, and defiant, but beneath the roots lies a chemical echo. In the soil, sediment, and bloodstreams of two nations, Agent Orange remains stubborn as guilt. The war ended in 1975, but the cleanup never did. In Da Nang, Bien Hoa, and other former air bases, engineers in hazmat suits dig out contaminated soil that glows under spectrometers decades after the last barrel was emptied. Each scoop of dirt carries micrograms of dioxin, a poison so persistent that defies half-lives and borderlines. The work is slow, expensive, and politically delicate. Both governments call it remediation, a word chosen carefully to avoid saying responsibility. Dow and Monsanto are long past the point of confession. They changed logos, merged, and pivoted towards biotechnology, speaking in the glossy dialect of sustainability. Their websites showcase smiling farmers and green fields, as if history were an optional add-on. The irony isn't lost on the veterans who now sit in VA waiting rooms under fluorescent lights, their hands trembling from neuropathy and their lungs riddled with cancer that somehow still requires verification of exposure. The files are thick, the words polite, the denial ongoing. Each year, new diseases are added to the official presumptive list, the quiet acknowledgement that the poison's reach was broader than anyone would admit when it mattered. Each edition feels like a belated apology wrapped in medical coding. Veterans groups celebrate the victories, but the celebrations are subdued. The men who needed these rulings most are the ones who didn't live to read them. The legacy lives on in quieter ways too, in the class action precedents that shaped environmental laws, in the mistrust between soldiers and their government, in the understanding that technological brilliance means little without moral restraint. It lives in the photographs, fields turn gray, villages stripped bare, children staring blankly at cameras that will forget their names. For the men who flew the planes and the ones who marched beneath them, memory is its own toxin. They remember the metallic tang of the mist, the way the jungle died overnight, the years of denial that followed. They remember being told it was safe, and they remember burying the friends who believed it. Agent Orange wasn't designed to kill people. It was designed to clear a path, and it did, straight through the illusion that war can be managed by science alone. The defoliant became metaphor for bureaucratic blindness, for corporate immunity, for a nation's habit of treating consequences as someone else's problem. The forests regrew, lush and unrepentant. The rivers cleansed themselves with time. Nature, given patience, heals. Humanity, given bureaucracy, does not. Agent Orange did its job. It cleared the jungle, exposed the enemy, and won nothing worth keeping. Its true harvest came years later, in hospital wards, in birth registries, in the quiet resignation of those who realize that sometimes the most enduring weapon of war isn't a bullet or a bomb, but a molecule that refuses to die. And so, the jungles whisper on, indifferent and eternal, their roots twisting through poisoned soil while men on both sides of the world count the cost. The trees have forgiven us, the earth has not, and the poison we left behind is still there, patient as history, waiting to remind us what happens when victory comes in barrels instead of peace. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.